Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today I want to tell you a little story. A few years ago, I ran into one of my good friends in a grocery store here in town, and we got talking about fishing, of course, and he's a die-hard muskie angler. He's one of these guys that if you're not fishing for muskie, why even fish? And he starts telling me about how he's catching a lot of really big bass, both largemouth and smallmouth, while trolling for muskie. So we start talking, and I'm like, that happens, right? You catch a few when you catch a bass, it's generally a big bass, and that happens occasionally. I mean, there's days you go out throwing big muskie baits and you catch 2 or 3 nice bass, but it's just one of those things that you kind of chalk up it's just a coincidence you came in contact with a bass. It's one of those things that you have happen while you're muskie fishing, because a lot of times when you muskie fish, you don't catch anything. So if you catch a big bass, it's just a bonus fish. Well, he's like, Matt, I'm telling you, I'm catching a lot of big bass doing it. And I'm like, well, what's the big deal, right? You're throwing a big muskie crank. And he's like, I'm throwing small muskie cranks. So we start talking. He's like, well, do you have any big square bills? And I was like, what do you mean by big square bills? He's like, well, like the big bass square bills. He's like, Strike King makes one, Lucky Craft has one, and he starts going on and on. I'm like, I don't have any big square bills. So he ends up sending me a text later in the day with a link to this big square bill. This is the Lucky Craft SKT Magnum. It's 4.5 inches long. It weighs 2 ounces. And in the bass world, that's a pretty big crankbait, especially for a squarebill crankbait. In the muskie world, this is considered a small crankbait. So he piqued my interest. So I start talking to him some more about what he's fishing, what kind of structure, that type of thing. And basically what he's doing is he's trolling isolated rock points, isolated rock humps that are anywhere from 15 feet of water or less. And he's letting these things just grind into the bottom. And he's triggering a lot of big largemouth and smallmouth up here in the northern lakes. So I ended up purchasing a couple of these. This is the Lucky Craft, like I said. Strike King's got a good one as well. They actually make 2 different sizes. I think they've got a 4-inch and a 4.5 inch. They don't weigh quite as much as this one, but they're really good crankbaits as well. And I've caught a lot of fish on those too. So after I came in contact with my buddy, I bought some of these, and he starts telling me about the type of structure. So I went out on a local lake here that's more known for smallmouth and started throwing this around. And the cool thing with these big square bills is they run really deep. You can get these baits down to 10 plus feet of water. So you can get them down into the same range where you would throw a traditional deep diving crankbait. But you've got a completely different body profile, and you've got the square bill attributes that make square bills so good, meaning these baits are meant to deflect off cover. They've got a really wide wobble, and they've got the bill shape with the nice cornered off square bill to deflect off cover, so they become less snag resistant and better baits to deflect off of those big rocks and those rock edges that he was trolling with. And that was the whole reason he was using these. He could get these down to the depth range that he wanted. They're big enough profile to appeal to a muskie, but they were pretty snag resistant when you compare them to other muskie crankbaits. And there's actually been a pretty good trend in the last couple of years to throw crankbaits in this 4.5 to 5 inch range for muskies, because of how effective they are. So he was kind of on the forefront of that, and he catches a lot of muskies on these as well. But the key here, guys, is you can get a square bill down to those deeper depths and generate bites from bigger fish that live in those areas. I've been blown away by the number of smallmouth that I've been able to catch on this bait. I look at it and I'm like, God, it's so big for the smallmouth. But one thing that we know about smallmouth up here in the North Country is that they like big baits. I mean, you will catch a pile of them by throwing a big musky topwater bait that's twice this size. It's one of those things more along the lines of they might have to hit it 3 or 4 times before you actually get a hook into them, because their mouth isn't big enough to engulf that whole bait. But you will catch a lot of fish doing it. So to add to this story, I was fishing a tournament on Lake Eufaula a few years ago. One of my roommates was catching really good quality fish. So this tournament was in May, end of May. It was post-spawn. The fish were just starting to get out on some ledges. And this is the bait that he was throwing. And he went out and he had a really good tournament. He had like 20 pounds a day by fishing this bait, but he was only generating 6 or 7 bites. And that's the key here. The quality of fish that you're going to catch on these big square bills is excellent. The problem is you limit the number of bites dramatically. So if you're fishing a crankbait in those areas, he probably could have caught, in my opinion, twice the number of fish, but he may not have generated those bigger bites because this bait does an extremely good, it's an extremely good replica of like a gizzard shad, that bigger shad profile bait. And the thing is, when you're talking about gizzard shad, a lot of times you're limiting yourself to the larger bass in that lake because the smaller bass aren't going to be eating a 6, 7, 8-inch gizzard shad as readily as they would, say, a threadfin shad. But the key here is it's a bait that gives you a different presentation at a deeper depth that you would normally have to fish a crankbait, a normal deep diving crankbait at if that was what you were after. Obviously you could fish your jigs or your drop shots or your bottom baits, but if you're trying to get a crankbait down to those deeper depths, that 10 to 14 foot of water, and you want a big profile, you don't have to throw a big deep diving crankbait that's going to hit the bottom and just grind into the bottom. You can run something like this that will get down and deflect off that same cover, be more snag resistant, and have a greater chance at generating those strikes from the bigger fish because these have a much better reflect bounce off of that structure, which generates those strikes that I'm always talking about, that reflexive strike that the bass just can't help themselves from eating. So if you don't have any of these in your arsenal, you might want to think about it. Now, it's not a bait that's for everybody. You know, this one, the Strike King one, is 2 ounces. It's a heavy bait. It's a big grinder when you know, it comes to fishing it. You do need a little bit heavier gear. You know, I've got here, this is a MHX 928 blank, so it's a long rod. That's a 7/8 rod. It's rated for up to 2 ounces. It's a blended composite rod, so it's a mixture, so it's still really good with the soft tip but the good parabolic bend, because when you're talking about these big hooks, you know, a lot of times you do get them on the outside of the face or around the outside or skin hooked, so you want a rod that's got some good bend to it. So you're not going to pick up just a simple crankbait rod and go throw this big bait around, because you're really going to load that rod up too much. But part of the key here is you can throw these baits a mile. I mean, you really can load the rod up, fire them off into the wind, which helps you get down to that 10, 14, 15 foot range. And because of that, it's also along that same line as the strolling technique. You know, guys always want to make the longest cast possible with a crankbait to keep your bait down in the strike zone for longer periods of time. And that's another advantage that you have with these giant square bills. You can throw them a mile. They don't flutter as much as a normal deep diving crankbait that may, you know, that's got a bigger lip, catches more wind. This is like throwing a rock into the water. So it's something you might want to think about. If you're a big crankbait enthusiast and you've got fish in your lake that are, you know, good quality 4-pound class fish or better, this is a really good bait to generate some of those big strikes and give the fish something different to look at. I can tell you most people are not throwing giant square bills out there. Especially up here in the North Country, I can tell you this is a bait that you'd have to go through a lot of tackle boxes before you found one. You know, they're down in the TVA lakes. There's guys that have them, but you still don't hear about guys talking about them too much. And in my opinion, I would rather throw this than throw like a 25-foot deep diving crankbait. And I realize that's for getting down to more extreme depths, but from a size standpoint, I think I get much better size fish on a big square bill. So check them out, guys. It's just something that we don't hear talked about much, and I feel like there is a need to use them and a time and a place for them that just really can allow them to excel over other crankbaits. So check them out. Giant square bills. It's something we don't hear many people talk about. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, share it on your social media, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have another video tomorrow for you.